Welcome to today's panel at the India-China Institute. My name is Mark Fraser, and I'm the co-director of the India-China Institute, also a professor of politics here at the New School. And it's my great honor to be the moderator for today's panel. So this is the year 2024. We've got about 6 weeks left in the year, but has been called a global election supercycle. More than 70 countries holding general elections, national elections of various forms. And this spring in India and Turkey, opposition parties performed somewhat better than expected against incumbent governments that remained in their incumbency, but nonetheless offered some hope for opposition politics in those countries. Then we have the US elections results last week, which of course continued in some ways a global pattern of punishing incumbent governments over economic conditions, but it was much more than that. The return of Trump to the American presidency raises questions about authoritarian trajectories in democratic regimes, which of course is the subject of today's panel. Now, while the American elections are most recently top of mind, today's panel is not meant to be another conversation about November 5th, but to reflect broadly on authoritarian or illiberal turns in democratic regimes. Now, to help us make sense of how we got here and what this new political order might mean, how it might evolve in the future, I'm honored to welcome our panel of 3 distinguished scholars of politics and political thought who have written about the fate of democracy and democratic institutions in India, Turkey, and the United States, as well as globally. In the interest of time, and since you can easily look up their bios, I'll just briefly introduce them and we'll get right to the conversation. They are Senem Aydin-Düzgit, who is a professor of international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabancı University in Istanbul, currently the Pierre Keller Visiting Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Jeffrey Isaac is the James Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University and is known to many of us political scientists for his role as the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Politics, which he edited from 2009 to 2017. He's also a contributor to the New School's public seminar platform. And last but not least, Pratap Banumeta is the Lawrence Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. All of our panelists have written important works on democracy and democratic theory, and they offer regular public commentary on the erosion of democratic institutions and democratic backsliding. So we'll begin with questions, and we'll have a conversation for an hour or so. And again, thanks to each of you for joining us here at the India-China Institute. So the first question is, how might we understand the rise of illiberal politics across so many democracies globally? Should we think in terms, as we're often told, in terms of economic inequalities and grievances being the source of this, the feeling that political institutions are simply incapable of addressing precarity and economic inequality, or more in terms of cultural politics, immigration, demographic changes, or as some say, we should look for the inherent flaws that exist in institutions of liberal democracy as they are practiced anyway in the 21st century. So I invite Senem to start us off in the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And thank you so much for inviting me also to be on this panel. Now, let me just start by saying that in the case of Turkey, this has been a very gradual process. So we have not had sort of a turn to competitive authoritarianism in just over a year or not. We've been going through this process, let's say, for the past decade or so. So this has been a long road. And some scholars date it back to 2013 when Turkey had the Gezi protests, you know, the big sort of protests against the demolition of a park in Istanbul. I personally, in my own work, dated back to, I would say, 2007 or so, during the second term of the AKP's power. So it's basically they came to power first in 2002 as a single party government. On their first term, they did not really, take any significant steps towards sort of dismantling the already fragile state of Turkish democracy, where, Turkish democracy had never been consolidated. But of course, it used to be in better shape before now. But basically what they did is that they actually took the steps or started taking the steps in, stacking the courts and taking capture of state institutions, in starting, very gradually the shrinking the civic space, etc., when they came to power with a much stronger popular mandate in 2007 elections. And after that, it has been a very gradual process of intensifying democratic decay and institutional capture. Now, perhaps one thing that I can add to this, that, there have been, of course, very important domestic factors behind the rise of AKP, that's Justice and Development Party, and behind the rise of Erdogan to power. There have been some domestic fault lines that go back all the way to the establishment of the Republic that are mostly also value-based, which I'm sure we're going to get to talk about later, so I don't want to talk about it at this point in time. But there have also been certain factors, in my opinion, that are quite common to other cases as well, that makes the timing, I would say, particularly specific. And that has to do with the international context. That is, Turkey used to be a country that's firmly attached to Western institutions, Western alliance, and that has very much been in conjunction with its Republican Westernization project at home. That had been changing with from 2005 onwards or so. First of all, relations with the European Union started to deteriorate because, well, the EU decided not to see Turkey as a full member, basically, and losing in time all leverage on Turkey's democratization and its domestic governance agenda. And of course, the changes in the international order and the increasing turn towards multipolarity is an important factor. The West and its democracy agenda, that for Turkey, that was very firmly located in the European Union, no longer became a reference point. So, and there are now alternatives. So now you have, of course, for some countries, this might be China. For the Turkish case, this has not been China. This has been Russia, for instance. This has been Gulf countries. But basically what happened is that the international context enabled this turn. It decreased the cost of the turn to a competitive authoritarian regime for the government and Erdogan, in a way in which, they could now at least make use of this changing context, develop further bilateral relations at times of need, and while doing that, avoid Western conditionality. So I guess that's what I can say for this first round, and I'm sure we can dig into various different aspects of this as we continue the conversation.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Who wants to go next? Pratap?
Thanks very much for this opportunity. It's a real privilege. I'd like to begin by putting one sort of controversial thought on the table. We are describing what is going on as authoritarianism. That's the premise of this panel. But the publics of the respective countries that we are talking about do not see what is going on as authoritarianism in quite the same way, right? I mean, the democracy in danger argument not only has not worked in the United States or in India, many would argue that's actually backfired. I mean, there are a lot of people saying, what democracy in danger? These are popularly elected leaders. Elections are still at least as free and fair as they ever were. I mean, what's your comparative benchmark? And I think it's worth reflecting on this fact that actually this description of what is going on as authoritarian is actually our description, not the description of a lot of the political agents who are, in a sense, kind of, I think, active. And one way of thinking about that, I think, puzzle in some senses, right? Why this gap between our characterization of this authoritarian and democratic publics is when we think of democracy, we think of checks and balances, we think of concentration of power. And I think what had happened in India, and I suspect more globally, is that the set of institutions that we took for granted as providing those checks and balances, many of our democratic publics thought that those checks and balances, that institutional framework, was actually a ruse to impede the exercise of agency of the publics in those democracies, right? That they had been captured by elites who were using these institutions to sort of, in a sense, thwart the will of the people, as it were, to serve particular elite interests. Those elite interests were exposed first and foremost in the financial crisis of 2009, which I think is a big structural backdrop to the story, where a particular consensus around globalization, regulatory reform, a certain kind of technocratic control of government that sort of collapses. And so, I think the energy of these populists actually comes from the fact that they claim to be restoring agency to the people through their persona or through the single political party they represent. So I think, so in that, and I think we have to think about why is it that so many publics across the world felt that that previous constellation of institutions, that ancient regime, we might say, of post 1989 liberal constitutionalism, they actually thought of that as impeding genuine democracy. So I mean I can get into Mr. Modi in kind of, I think, more detail. Obviously, I think in India's case, those background conditions and dissatisfactions were there. But Mr. Modi it has to be said, has exceptional political gifts. He could tap into those circumstances politically, in some senses, brilliantly. I think in his personal case, the sense of identification that he evoked in terms of his own personal biography, I'm the first kind of genuinely major mass leader who's not from the Nehru Gandhi family. That contrast that I'm standing against this dynastic ancient regime, I stand for personal rectitude against that old corruption. Certainly is I think an important part. But I think the most important element in the Indian case is the alliance, in a sense, between this authoritarianism or populism, if you want to call it that, and a certain kind of Hindu nationalism. Because one of the important features in India of this turn to authoritarianism, that it draws its legitimacy from politics of ethno-nationalism. It's not somebody simply saying, I'm going to do away with checks and balances. It's somebody saying, I'm going to do away with these checks and balances, in part in service of this project of creating a Hindu nation, which will be the best expression of restoring agency to the genuine majority of the country. And I think, I mean, ethno-nationalism has long roots in global politics. But I think it's the mobilization of ethno-nationalism that has given this authoritarianism a much more ominous turn.
Thanks, Jeff. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So I have three. I very much agree with the two previous interventions. I have three thoughts, and I've had the ability to collect my thoughts because I'm going third. So when you first asked your question and you listed a bunch of factors, to oversimplify: economics, culture, demographics, federal institutions, what is it? And I was inclined to say yes.
All of the above.
And I think basically we would all agree that it's very overdetermined, and there's no single factor that explains either the global dimension of this or the dimension of this within any of the distinct countries. I want to make 2 points then. The first is that in some ways, the US case is very different. Well, actually, the US is just very different in lots of ways. But on the one hand, until very recently, most political scientists and US historians and commentators imagined that the US was like a very consolidated democracy. Certainly, in historical terms, the conventional wisdom is it's more consolidated than India or Turkey. And, that itself is a complicated question. But it relates to the simple fact that in the case of Trumpism, the MAGA Republican movement, which does have so many parallels to Modi and Erdogan and some of the same dimensions of ethno-nationalism and everything, It's true, he was just reelected. I happen to think that he's going to bring disaster, and there are going to be many consequences. I'm happy to talk about it. It's not just that he was elected. The things he promised, he's going to try to do a lot of them. He will succeed to some extent, and it's not going to be good. But it's too early to say that, like, we're in a situation of one-party hegemony. Here, it's quite likely, I think, but it's too early to say now. You know, he won. He had 4 years. Biden won. Now he's back. Who knows? So there's more uncertainty in this situation. I can't talk to you about the authoritarian trajectory of the US in quite the same way as my two friends can talk about what's been going on in the last 10 years in their countries, where there's been a much more institutionalized, politically hegemonic authoritarianism. Okay, I just want to point that out. I'm not hopeful. I'm not hopeful at all. And in fact, I think geopolitically, it's terrible for the whole world. Okay, I want to just make that point. The second point I want to make goes to what Pratap said, which I very much agree with. And so you mentioned that I've been a longtime contributor to Public Seminar at the New School and also Democracy Seminar. When Jeff Goldfarb founded Public Seminar, and I used to write very regularly for Public Seminar, I published a piece in 2017 that they ran as a symposium on illiberal democracy, on the idea of illiberal democracy. It was based upon Viktor Orban's speeches and taking from that the idea that there was a perspective there that one could see in Turkey, in India, in other places. That generated a really interesting discussion about whether illiberal democracy is even possible or whether it's necessarily authoritarian. And my basic argument was it's possible as a project. Now, in practice, it may become authoritarian, but as a project, and this goes to Pratap's point, I very much agree. Liberal democracy, what we understand liberal democracy to be, clearly is on the defensive. And for many in the mass electorate, they imagine that the authoritarian, populist, ethno-nationalist leaders that they are electing represent the will of the people. And in fact, you know, in the case of Trump, if I could just say one more thing, this is really interesting. So there's a lot of pundit commentary after the election that the defense of democracy argument utterly failed. Okay, here. But there's also some interesting observations that, in fact, a lot of Trump voters thought they were defending democracy. And in fact, while Trump is so anti-liberal and racist and xenophobic and all of that, it's also true that the central rhetoric of his entire being is that the election was stolen from the people. He stands for the people, and it's about reclaiming electoral legitimacy and also reclaiming cultural legitimacy. So he's claiming to be a democratic leader. And what he says is the Biden administration is weaponizing against conservatives, whatever. So I agree with Pratap. I think we really need to think about different understandings of democracy and whether or not it's possible to articulate and then politically empower a defense of liberal democracy in this setting. And I'm very pessimistic.
Yeah, I think going to building on this conversation so far, one of the things that Senan brought up, the concept of institutional capture, is one that I'm still puzzling over, in the sense that how does it? I mean, it happens in different ways with different power alignments, but what we wouldn't expect the courts, the parliament, the legislatures, the media, civil society to cave. So maybe it's gradually, as Senan pointed out, but what is the dynamic by which we lose what political scientists call this horizontal accountability, so that these other institutions that are a check on the prime minister's office or the presidency seem to give way, and so what actors or agencies or forms of power are causing this institutional capture that, albeit gradually, seems to be very significant, and it does take 10 years sometimes before you see the real consequences of it. Anyone can start with that one, please.
I mean, maybe I can, if we go in the same order, Mark, because I'm going to come back to the institution business, but just can I just say something on the basis of what Pratap and Jeffrey has just said?
Please.
I mean, I understand the pessimism, and I do, of course, I do see where it's coming from, and I share the sentiment. Having said that, I also think that, I mean, again, if you look at the Turkish context, right? So we've had this government for over 20 years now, although they weren't always like this, but still. And about half of the population, Turkish population, is still very much strongly opposed to the government. And they consider it undemocratic and also illegitimate. So I think we should perhaps take a little bit more care in, looking at how these entire populations view democracy, because not everybody is on the same page here. These are very polarizing actors. Polarization is a strategy of dividing and ruling. And we can talk about the basis of that polarization, etc., which are sometimes similar across some of these cases as well. I see very important parallels, for instance, between United States and Turkey in that regard. And there was a global polarization book that we did with Tom Carruthers at Carnegie a couple of years back, where we've seen that the most similar cases were US and Turkey. But anyway, we can talk about that. But when you have that kind of polarization, then you can still win elections because of majoritarianism and state capture and all that, but still have almost half of the country very much strongly opposed to your understanding on your claim of democracy. But of course, for those who support the government, then that's also a mixed sort of bag of who supports them for what. Now, some are aware of the turn to authoritarianism, and they don't have any issue with it because they see certain benefits for themselves, economically, for instance. And again, something we can talk about when Mark touches upon the other questions. So I don't want to talk about the whole story here. But then you also have others, sort of this core voter group, that think that this is what democracy is because they get to vote every 4 years, and that's fine. And as long as you don't take that away from them, they're not looking at institutional capture, etc. They're just thinking, well, the others did it when they were in power 20 years back, right, and before. So what's the problem now if this party is doing it, right? Again, links into the polarization dynamics as well that we need to look into. But anyhow, we can talk more about that in a minute. I mean, it's also about what something Pradap said. I mean, those core voters see that, Turkey's or India's status is being elevated. And the status of the people are being elevated, not just domestically, but internationally as well. So no wonder that Modi or Erdogan take special care to position themselves as world leaders in the changing multipolar stage. So perhaps that kind of links into the US question as well. It's all about making US great again, right? I mean, through international politics as well. But anyhow, so I'm not going to go, too much with this. I'm going to go back to the institution question. So I don't want to sidetrack. But yes, institutions are a very important part of the story, I think, right? And again, institutional capture too, at least in the Turkish case, it's been gradual, but in the Hungarian case, it's been gradual as well, right? So, so I think there are important parallels with others. Courts have been targeted. Courts have been crucial in the case of the Turkish turn to authoritarianism. I mean, it started, I would say, in 2010, when there was a constitutional referendum to make certain, reforms to the judicial system. And there, the government did not do it alone. They made certain alliances with certain societal and political groups along the way by giving these groups certain concessions of one way or another. So on paper, for instance, back in 2010, many people thought, well, the constitutional referendum looks good enough. It's going to reform the judiciary in sort of in a way that's going to make it a little bit more accessible and democratic and open to different segments of society and this and that. But then the big question was not what was written on paper. The big question was, how was it going to be implemented? And implementation came in such ways in which they proved very instrumental in the stacking of the courts. So courts are a very important story. And again, it did not come as a way of, automatic stacking day one. No, it came through a constitutional referendum that seemed quite good enough for about 60-something% of the population at the time. So it was all a question of political will. How were they going to use these provisions? And many people acted in good faith when they voted yes to the constitutional referendum. I personally didn't, but I know many of my colleagues did. Very democratic people back in the day, right? Media is very important. Very, very important. Again, started gradually. Starts with fines, sort of punishment punishing some media outlets here and there, taking them to court here and there. But then this is not the only process through which media capture happens. There's a whole political economy behind it as well. Ownership of the media landscape changes. That is where you need to look at, right? So you start, people getting out of the media landscape because it's becoming difficult, for instance, to get adverts, right, from companies who feel scared of the government to do that. So there's a whole financial system of it behind it. And of course, in later stages, when they have fuller control of the judiciary, then judicial targeting of the media landscape also becomes much easier, and the policing of speech as well. So at the end of the day, like in the Turkish case, you might end up with very, very small pockets of oppositional media with just a few exceptional outlets. And civil space too, you mentioned it in your email to us, Mark. So I think, just very briefly, I could say that the civic space has been shrinking over, again, gradually, right? Unless you are a civil society organization that is pro-government explicitly, it is extremely difficult to find the money, right? So at the end of the day, it boils down to the funding. And on certain issues like Kurdish issue or democracy and human rights, there is also a legal aspect to it, which might scare you off. But there's also, as I said, the financial aspect to it. You need to function as a CSO. And of course, where do you go? You go to external funding. And now that is also becoming more and more difficult as the government is working on a new bill on the foreign agent law that is very similar to the one that they've just passed in Georgia, if you've been following. And that's a law that Russians have had for a long time, which I think is also an inspiration. And again, something we can talk about in the next rounds, maybe. And it's not passed yet, but if it does, it's so vague and broad that it can criminalize an academic, civil society organization or anything that, gets its funds from the external funders and produces work and output that might not necessarily toe the government line. So there's always that fear that's lurking around you. So it's not like they don't come and target you day one, but you know that you're operating in this environment where money will be tight and your freedom might be at stake. And it's that environment that also pushes people to self-censorship, etc. So the institutional capture business is something that should be at least viewed in a sort of a broader, in the context of a broader picture as such.
Would it be okay if I went next?
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thanks. because what you said, Senem, just prompted a couple of thoughts. One of which is I really appreciate your clarification, about the relationship between public opinion and these rhetorics that vie as almost like brands for political power. You're absolutely right. It's not the case that like vast majorities of these electorates are endorsing the rhetoric. There are all kinds of reasons why people are voting in these parties. And there is a core that identifies with the rhetoric. And the real question is what these parties in power do. You did such a brilliant job of talking about how they will constrict the space and limit the opportunity for what could even be a majority of the public in some ways, limit the ability to be politically effective. So I want to just thank you for that. I think that's a really important point. The other thing, I want to talk briefly about capture in a way that maybe even more directly addresses your question, Mark, because Senem, one dimension of the question is how do these, let's just say, illiberal or anti-liberal political forces that are put countries on authoritarian trajectories, how do they capture institutions once in power? And that's the fundamental question. And in fact, both of you guys, I fear that your situations are like the future of the US. Okay. But I want to also talk a little bit more critically about the idea of capture, because and I think you guys will agree with me. One premise of the idea that these people are capturing is that before they came along, there was no capture. There was just like free and good. And the truth of the matter is that's not true. Like the liberal democracy that in some ways we think is better than the alternative that we are defensively trying to defend has always been in some ways corporatist, has always been in some ways corrupt, has involved different kinds of state capture. Going back to the 60s and, Theodore Lowy's book, The End of Liberalism, it's been understood. So it's not the case that there was like a pure democracy that then has been taken over. And I think part of the reason why these guys are able to come in is because of the frailty of the institutions, the ways the institutions have failed to perform, and the way in which over time they've lost legitimacy, which is, I think, something that you guys have also talked about. So I think that's a really important part of this story, the vulnerability that allows people like Trump to capture and say, I'm not capturing, I'm returning it to you. I'm rescuing it from the captor of the liberal tyrants. You know, it's a very topsy-turvy situation.
That was exactly my
So if
thought, that there is this pathway, almost Turkey's the lead boat in the convoy, followed soon behind by India and then the United States later. Sorry, Pratap.
So, I mean, just to build on, I mean, Senem and Jeffrey have kind of brilliantly articulated the story. I mean, I think it is important to, I think, underscore that point, right? That the first stage in this kind of capture story is the loss of legitimacy of the previous regime. People simply did not trust that liberal institutions actually are producing truth. It's very hard to say Mr. Trump lies when, these democracies were lying about war through and through and was very manifestly visible. Um, the promise of social justice, whatever kind of minimal terms in which you liberals described it, even that increasingly came to be seen as being betrayed, in a sense, by the previous regimes. And I think it's that loss of credibility that's really the kind of big story. And I mean, I think Senem is right that it's not that there isn't political space to resist this. I mean, even in India, I mean, 55 to 60% of the voters still are open to voting for other parties. It's just that I think the alternative forces, if all they promise is a return to the status quo ante, I think it becomes a very, very hard sell and very hard proposition, exactly for the reasons that, in a sense, Jeffrey described. I think the second feature of this, which I think is important, which is, at least in the Indian case, like with Turkey, the consolidation is gradual. And there's a term we use these days in India, which is these regimes have been quite clever in the sense that, so this is not a regime that is working with mass repression, as in mass arrests, hundreds of thousands of people being arrested, like the emergency in India in the 1970s. It's working with a kind of statistical innocence. I mean, a few selected targets that send the message out to everybody, and they can come around and say, look, I mean, compared to what time are we actually guilty of, egregious repression, right? And I think it's, in a sense, the very, very clever use of administrative law, exactly the apparatus that the previous regimes bequeathed us. The use of public order law, as I said, exemplary targeting. I mean, it's a kind of incredible form of social control in some ways, and that has, I think, in a sense, been quite successful. I think in the Indian case, it has to be said, perhaps like Turkey, that a large part of Indian capital uh, very much threw its weight behind this authoritarianism. And I think it is important because that capital is very much part of the story about how they managed to control the information order. In some senses, the media story is entirely a supply side story in India. It's not about market competition. In fact, if we had genuine market competition in media, I think it would be a much more diverse media landscape. It's just the fact that large numbers of Indian capitalists are willing to bankroll loss-making channels day in and day out, so long as they kind of disseminate, in a sense, particular ideology. But I think there's one, I think, more thing which I want to just put on the table in this. And, given the results of the US election, one thing that surprised people was the widening of Trump's social base, right? I mean, it's a much more multiracial, much more multi-ethnic mandate in some senses than previously thought possible. And I think the same is true in India as well. And one of I think, the challenges of left and center politics. So when we think of checks and balances, we think of two kinds, right? We think of institutionals, the forms of the constitution. There's the judiciary, there's the bureaucracy, And the process of what happened to the judiciary and bureaucracy is exactly what Senem described. I mean, the Indian judiciary was one of the first to cave, and in a sense has, almost institutionalized majoritarianism. But I think the more interesting and complicated story is that normally checks and balances are also social checks and balances, right? There's a sense of cross-cutting cleavages, whether of class or social identity, that we think will form a kind of check on the concentration of power, right? And I think one of the most remarkable stories about India was, I think the left and center were quite deterministic in the way they thought about politics. So, I mean, I'm being a little reductive here. So either it's class determinism or it's some form of identity determinism, right? Dalits will vote certain way, backward caste will vote certain way. And I think one of the things the right has actually been very good at is a much more generative conception of politics. None of these are natural categories. They are always products of political mobilization. And I think the left and center have been constantly surprised that what they thought of as naturalized checks and balances on a particular ideology simply do not exist. I mean, if you look at caste voting patterns in India, Mr. Modi's great achievement was to transform the BJP from an upper caste party to an OBC party, to mobilize lots and lots of Dalit votes, to the point where it's not as easy to say as it used to be that, caste is going to determine voting in India. So I think there's a sense in which the social identities which we relied on to create particular kinds of electoral coalitions that would act as a natural check and balance, those kind of have been dissolving for very complex sociological and economic reasons. They have become much more complex, much more internally contradictory. And that's the space which the right kind of mobilized in saying, okay, we are going to create these new identities, speak to some, MAGA, larger nationalism or something like that.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Just following up on this, it's important that everyone get a chance. On that really, really interesting observation about identities, and I think you're absolutely right. I think this goes to deeper cultural issues in terms of the communicative sphere. And, so the one way to think about this is, how could the center left or the left or even the center rethink the question of identities so that a better collective identity could somehow be promoted and win, And then I asked myself, like, just to use the US example, what that would be. What would be the equivalent of like a centrist Trump, let's just say? And I think, well, would Taylor Swift run? And I'm being serious. Like, part of the dimension here has to do with charismatic leadership and also the weakening of parties themselves. So what the right has done is it's become really not a party. It's like a cult of personality, authoritarian populist rhetoric, and a new kind of collective actor. And I'm not sure that the left, that's not what the values of the left are about. And how that could be, it seems to me, like you could say, yeah, if only Bernie Sanders. But I think in this media environment, in this cultural setting, the notion that it's easy to replicate that if you're not like interested in demagoguing, I think it's really hard to do that. Demagoguery has a social, communicative, cultural base. Anyway, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful, and it's leading to my next question. But before I throw that out, I want to acknowledge that thank the audience for coming. Apologies for the technical issues. We will provide a full recording of this session to everyone in a day's time or so, and in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I will open up. Well, right now anyway, I'll invite the audience to begin asking questions by dropping them in the Q&A box. And then we'll turn to them in 10 or 15 minutes time. But this conversation, as we've heard it, Senem talking about polarization, Pratap and Jeff talking about in some ways, the shifting basis of popular support and the faulty assumptions that the left and the center made about kind of political preferences of certain groups of people being fixed or at least stable. And so I wanted to turn to the question of popular base of support. And, is it stable? Do these governments in each case, including the new Trump administration, is there any pressure to provide certain kinds of goods? Are they symbolic goods? Are they material goods? And will there be any kind of risk of alienating that base if some of these grievances, economic or otherwise, are not met? In other words, I'm also asking kind of, is this a realignment, a new stable coalition that we would expect to be somewhat durable, regardless of what these authoritarian leaders deliver in terms of goods to the electorate?
Shall we go in the same order, Mark? Shall I?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I mean, but I'm gonna respond to that, but also connected with some of the points that were made. I know, I'm sorry, I always sort of kind of backtrack, but then, I fully agree with some of the stuff that Jeffrey and Pratap have said. And also, I think they sort of connect to your question as well in different ways.
Sure.
Now, first of all, of course, you have this resentment issue, right? In different shapes and colors in each different country case that we have here. Now, in the Turkish case, again, something that Jeffrey said, and I fully agree with, that you never had a perfect democracy to begin with, right? And of course, nothing compared to what US has, for instance, right? And so, yes, there was a transition to democracy after the military coups, etc., but that democracy had never been consolidated. And there was a certain elite. That is true. There was the Kemalist elite, the Republican elite. And that was quite an exclusive club in many ways, right? So there was a certain ideology of Westernization and Kemalism that you had to, strictly abide with, which also included the fact that, for instance, you were not allowed in public displays of religion, right? Like the headscarf in state administrations and etc. And these were very strictly enforced, particularly in the 1990s, right? With the help, of course, of the military and the judiciary, and also different parts of the bureaucracy and the state apparatus. So the resentment was real. It's not completely unfounded. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not completely fabricated, right? And it goes back to the origins of the Republic as well. And it's been easy, relatively speaking, for Erdogan to tap into that, right? In the form of the people versus the elite binary. So this is the people that have been wronged all these years, and I'm here to represent them. I look like them, I live like them, I speak like them, I don't speak English. That's a good thing, right? For the other elite, that's not a good thing. Or how are you going to be an international? But then for the others, they see an extension of themselves in this man, right? And this doesn't change regardless of the fact that they are, in fact, the elite, and they have been the elite for the past decade or so. They control the resources, they control the funding, the finance, the patronage networks of the neo-patrimonial economy, they control the state apparatus, so they are the elite. But regardless of the facts on the ground, he can still tap into that resentment no matter what. Okay, and I think that is very important. So religion plays into it, in the Turkish case at least. Identity plays into it. So a cleavage that's already been there, gets turned into a polarizing instrument, and that constitutes the core of the vote of around 30% or so. Now, but then the rest of the vote comes from different places. And that's where you should look at, because it's really, in polarized contexts like this, it's really that 1 or 2% or 1 to 5% or so that really makes the difference. And there they have to deliver. And that is why, for instance, if you take the last presidential elections, for instance, that we had back in 2023, when you looked at the economy, the macroeconomic indicators were all over the place in Turkey. They still are. But the government took specific steps to win certain parts of different constituencies, just enough to win the elections. So there's very much smart, I would say, and strategic economic statecraft that was there. So it's not just that they're just relying on polarization and this polarizing divide. They're also trying to deliver just enough, okay, to go past that 50% threshold, for instance, because, now in the presidential elections in Turkey, that's what you need to do. So, for instance, they increased spending just before the elections. They channeled it to pensioners or certain groups, lower classes, or this and that. In the longer run, this put huge strains on the Turkish economy, right? But then the goal at that point was to win those elections, and then we'll deal with whatever comes later, which is what they're trying to do right now. They're trying to pick up the seat pieces, but it worked, okay? It got them just enough votes. That was like 52% or so, just tipped. And also, we have not talked about the opposition in these countries, which is also very important in the sense that you do have some hints of hope as well in terms of how to talk to the other side, right? Something that Jeffrey brought up. I mean, for instance, if you look at the local elections that we had earlier this year, but also the local elections before that, when the Istanbul mayor came to power for the first time in Istanbul, his discourse was all about the so-called radical love, okay? I know it might sound very corny or kind of not, but it worked. It worked because in a way, when you demonize the other camp, they're bigots, they're this, they're that, they're racist, and the people who vote them are like that as well. And when you equate that, then you consolidate them further in that camp. And that's what I've been seeing in some of the debates in the US as well after the elections. And, that's what I was been telling my students as well here at the Kennedy School, right? I mean, this is just, you don't do that. If one thing that we've learned from other cases like this in Turkey, Hungary, countries that have been on this road earlier on than you, then you don't solidify that vote by othering them further with your discourse and practice. That doesn't work. But the alternative, at least in Istanbul and Ankara and the big cities where the local mayors won, not just because they're performing better, but also because they sort of internalize this kind of, I'll reach out to you, I don't care who you're voting for, I'm not going to campaign on this identity-based rhetoric. I refuse that. So, and this sort of, so I think that how you argue for that and how you, but of course, these people are not left-wing, right? They're not a Sanders type, like, Jeffrey said. They are very much centrist, populist leaders as well. Of course, they're more pro-democratic and everything, at least for the time being. God knows what happens in the future. But this is how they articulated themselves. So I think that's also something important to think about. And my final words about this is, and about the performance business, the people have to be convinced that the opposition will do a better job than the government. So they might be suffering under the economy or whatever, but then they're thinking, well, yes, the government is messing this up, but at the end of the day, it's the government that will fix it. If the opposition comes, it's probably that they're going to make it worse, okay? And once that kind of sets in, it becomes very difficult for the opposition voters, for the government vote to switch. In local elections, it's easier to switch because the costs are less, right? I mean, local elections, it's just, the control of the municipality, or if things go wrong, they can't go fundamentally. It's not like the national economy or foreign policy, security, and all this and that, right? The fear and the stakes are much higher. So they're thinking, well, unless you have a very strong charismatic candidate, which was one fundamental mistake that Turkish opposition did last year. It was a weak candidate. And that could not speak across the identity divide, and also a very divided opposition. They were united in theory, yes, the opposition coordination was there, but it wasn't coherent, and they were not united around very core similar principles. And also there were divisions among them that Erdogan could just spot and manipulate and sort of, trigger further. And once people have an idea that this opposition won't be able to hold it together if they're in power, that's it, you're done. So even if the government is not performing very well, right, they're going to be better performance than a hypothetical opposition if they come to power. So I think this is also something that we should keep in mind. So.
Yes.
So, I mean, once again, after Senema spoke, I mean, most of the points have been covered. And I think
Sorry.
two of our points are particular are actually very important. One, I think, elections are a game of competitive credibility. I mean, the other guy just has to be marginally better than the opposition and can win. But the second, the importance of, I think, local government, and particularly in India's case, federalism. I mean, the states are a lot more competitive. There's more turnover, some hope in states. But I think on your question, Mark, about the sort of the social basis and the economic basis of these regimes, I think a couple of points. One, of course, Mr. Modi, in some respects, is actually quite competent. I mean, he's not bad at macroeconomic management. He's not bad at building out state capacity in significant areas. He has built out something like a kind of welfare coalition at the bottom, which even many mimicked actually the strategies of what opposition parties were doing in states. So in some respects, I mean, it's a record that doesn't invite, as it were, widespread anger. I mean, that dissatisfaction, but it's right. But I think there's a couple of things about this economic story which at least is puzzling to me, which and just reading stuff about the US elections makes it clear, which is, so how do voters measure not just their sense of economic well-being? I mean, what do they give priority to, right? But also, what is it that gives them a sense of confidence that there is actually a better future here, a sense of futurity, right? So, nominally, when you look at the surface, American official inflation rate, unemployment figures, it actually doesn't look that bad. But obviously, there were particular measures voters were using for this, right? And I think we are in a world where I think the gap, again, in a sense, between what we used to think was the voters' sense of their own well-being and what they are prioritizing is perhaps, I think, shifted more than we realize and more than we can actually capture in, I think, the very kind of abstract discourse of economic well-being we have. I think I'm kind of increasingly puzzled in India. I think the second thing I have to say, which is, so if you look around the world, right, there isn't a single centrist politician who's popular. Even Keir Starmer, who ostensibly, has come on a kind of centrist agenda, his popularity has dipped dramatically within 2 months in power, right? And to me, it actually suggests that there is a kind of systemic crisis of the development models that are around in the world. And by the way, it's not just true in liberal democracies. I mean, China is struggling, right? In a sense with, it has to give up on whatever that old Deng Xiaoping version of centrism was, right? In some ways. And in the Indian case in particular, both governments, I mean, not just Mr. Modi, but even the previous Congress government, they have not been able to crack this question of how do you generate enough high productivity employment that actually creates for, that makes for inclusive growth. The bottom you can take care of with some kind of welfare coalition, I mean, some kind of state intervention, and at those levels of income, it actually matters. The top 20%, does very well in this economy, can take advantages of its opportunities. But it's, in a sense, this kind of middle 60, right, 46, that seems to be kind of stuck somewhere, where there isn't that sense of either income's rising, consumption is flat, private investment in that is flat. And the amazing thing about Mr. Modi is that he's actually inflicted quite a bit of hardship on the sector. I mean, two of his biggest economic decisions, demonetization and the goods and services tax, actually were very, very heavy burdens on micro, small enterprises, right? And yet he's actually weathered those. In fact, he often kind of used the language of sacrifice to, in some senses, elicit support. So I would say that, I think the structural conditions of producing economic dissatisfaction are there. I don't think the economic performance is such that this is going to be a stable coalition. But I think the alternative is struggling to articulate what that vision, credible vision, looks like that doesn't also look quite like the status quo or something that's quite kind of timid and tepid.
Can I say a few things? Yeah. And again, there's such a degree of overall agreement here. This is a great conversation. You know, I think it's not people saying the same thing. It's deepening the discussion and like articulating in different ways some of the same points. So I want to speak very briefly about American exceptionalism, you know, which is often taken to be a sign of, you know, well, Reagan said the last best hope of freedom or whatever. This goes back, you know, to John Winthrop coming over, you know, across the Atlantic Ocean, whatever. It's a long story about how America is a unique land of freedom. Certainly in the post-World War II period, the United States claimed and has claimed ever since to be a beacon of hope and to represent freedom and democracy, whatever. So while you were talking, Pratap, I wrote down on my notepad the words American crazy with crazy underlined, because I think that in some ways, this situation here is distinctively crazy in two ways that represent something that, you know, in some ways, I think you guys have like better leaders. So very briefly, the first dimension of crazy is what I would describe as the crazy credulity of large segments of the American electorate. You know, Pratap said how, you know, the truth is how economic well-being is measured. It's not the ways we normally think. The fact of the matter is, Donald Trump is a failed businessman, a carnival barking brand of himself, who was served for 4 years and really delivered nothing except nothing while 1 million people died of COVID. And large numbers of Americans, many, many, many millions beyond his base, believe that he's better for the economy. Like, what is that? I'm not saying they're crazy or stupid, but like, that's something. It's a craziness. I'm not saying the people are crazy, but there's a craziness in that, in the credulity, in the extent to which imaginary enemies, Haitians eating people's pets and whatever, is part of an overall discourse that leads to his increase in popularity. What is that? Okay, that's one level of craziness. The other related is the craziness of the individual. Okay, like you said, Pratap, and I think it's probably true that Modi like isn't such a bad manager of the economy. And I'm sure he has like some people around him who are like reasonably intelligent and have experience on these things. Right now, Matt Gaetz is going to be the Attorney General of the United States. Tulsi Gabbard is going to be in charge of like national security and national intelligence. Most of these people have no business being in the executive branch of government. So this is, for the next 4 years, the most powerful country in the world is going to be having a really interesting experiment where, like on steroids, some of the authoritarian populism in Turkey or, you know, in India or in Hungary or other places is going to be for 4 years practiced. Who knows what the results of this will be? But it's in some ways bizarre, and it's very frightening because it's so important in terms of global politics. The most immediate casualty of this, I'm not sure if it's the Ukrainian people or if it's the Palestinian people, okay? They're the immediate casualties. He will try to deport 10 million undocumented or more. Maybe he'll only deport 2 or 3. Massive. It's already clear. The people he's putting in charge are like, they're all about this, okay? It's going to happen. It's going to be a disaster in so many ways. And I think it's unlike what you guys have experienced in some ways in its craziness. He'll have the finger on the nuclear. I mean, okay, I'm sorry. Now I've gotten a little crazy. Okay, along the lines of American craziness, I've become a little unhinged.
No, Jeffrey,
that
I fully
actually-
understand. Sorry, I was at a Zoom meeting the day after the 2023 elections in Turkey, when the opposition, you know, vote very, I mean, and I broke down and I started crying in front of everyone, and I thought, oh yeah, I'm just gone crazy, you know, this is it. So I fully share the sentiment. I just wanted to say that,
Thank you.
that we know how it feels.
But substantively, this leads substantively this leads to my next just comment or question rather, which is it builds on what has just been said about and going back to the ways in which, as Pratap mentioned, this exemplary targeting of civil society and other organizations. We haven't talked about higher education institutions yet, but we could do so in the context of civil society. But the broader question that I had kind of indicated to you all in advance was what are the sources of opposition and resistance? What are the strategies? How can opposition parties, social movements, and others not only survive, but maybe turn the tide back towards something more pluralistic and resembling liberal democracy or some other something to replace it. So this is we'll turn to the audience questions next, but I did want us to since we just talked about kind of how we're feeling in the wake of an electoral result, 2023 Turkey this week in the United States. But I know Pratap, you were about to say something too, and I don't want to divert from that.
No, I mean just one good thing to just I think just put on the table. I think again building on what Jeffrey said, which is, I mean, in a way, actually, I mean, I think one of the best things that's happened to comparative politics is that kind of the whole myth of American exceptionalism will collapse, and actually there are methods to studying American politics that have been better used elsewhere. But I think the one kind of specific point, right, which is in some senses historically, right, nationalism has been an enabler of liberal democracy, and it's also been the biggest threat to it consistently. I mean, it's like the undershadow, right, of liberalism and liberal democracy. Liberalism has never had an answer to the question of membership. It's had a great theory of the state, never really not only not had a theory of membership, but liberals often have been on the wrong side of theories of membership historically, in some ways when it comes to ethnic minorities and stuff. And in some senses, the common kind of thread running through the US, India, Turkey, and all of that, right, is actually, I mean, to my mind, the most threatening aspect of this conjuncture is less the sort of institutional authoritarianism, and that you might still be able to recover in some senses, I mean, depending on how deep the damage is. It's that if the poison of various forms of ethno-nationalism, exclusion on the basis of identity, not only becomes institutionalized, but there's a kind of disinhibition around it, right? That there is a kind of politics of hate, a politics of stigmatization, a legitimizing of vigilante violence or state violence in the name of nationalism. That poison is going to be much, much more difficult to put back. Yes. I mean, that's, I think, the poison I worry about most, I think, in India. I mean, Supreme Court judges, you can still change at some point, there is. And my worry about the opposition, going back to your point, Mark, is that I think, except for Rahul Gandhi, who's the one figure who's been at least ideologically clear in this, most of the opposition has also decided that not actually going to frontally confront the growing communalization and ethno-nationalism taking on board, that somehow it's a losing proposition to actually confront that. Now, to my mind, that's a mistaken danger, because it just leads to a greater sense of cumulative power of this incense idea. I mean, I would say the most boring thing about, I think, resistance is, and this the opposition is struggling with, which is, there is a word these days used often, authenticity. And I think where one of the reasons people don't seem to trust the opposition as much is somehow it conveys a sense of being more calculating. Maybe this is a kind of unfair characterization. But I think it's not entirely unfair, in the sense that I think opposition parties across the world are finding it hard to project the sense that what they're doing out of some genuine conviction. So it becomes very easy to dismiss them as, okay, this is kind of triangulation for power. In some senses, take a cynical view of, I think, that opposition politics. Now, where you get a kind of opposition that can convey the sense of, and that's Trump's biggest charms, Mr. Modi's biggest charms, that even when they're lying, there's almost like they're their own person. right? They are, in a sense, setting the agenda. They're not second guessing beyond the point. I mean, they are also crafty political animals, but they're not second guessing beyond the point. So I think having an opposition that has the courage of its own conviction is the first minimum step.
Hmm. Can I?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
next, so again, I'm incredibly pessimistic. One of the interesting things that's happening here now is Democratic governors, the governors of Democratic governors of states are like talking among themselves and organizing. And by the way, this also happened in 2016, and strategizing for ways of resisting some of the most, let's just say, anti-liberal dimensions of Trumpism. And by the way, that fueled Trump. I mean, Trump has said in this campaign, he may actually go in to cities. And, if they're sanctuary cities and there's not enough enforcement of immigration, deportation, then it'll be done, by ICE or by the National Guard. So United States has uniquely, well, it's not the only federalist constitution, but federalism is very, very important in lots of ways, many of which has sustained racism, racial segregation, and also have sustained like the most anti-liberal tendencies in the United States. It's also a resource of opposition that will be a basis of political opposition in the states. But I want to speak very briefly about this as someone who, again, I grew up in New York City. I was born in Brooklyn. I lived in Queens. I taught at Fordham University. But for the last 37 years, I teach at Indiana University. I live in the state of Indiana. That is a very red state. And what is happening, what will happen, is some of the intensification of the differences between blue states, mainly coastal, but then you also have Illinois, and then large swaths of the country where a great many people, including liberals like me, live, where we will be under state governments that are very authoritarian. This is happening in the state of Indiana in terms of legislation that is like threatening academic freedom that in the public higher education. And it's happening in terms of abortion rights. Okay. Like if you can get up to Illinois, good, but increasingly, if you're a woman and you need reproductive health care, you're not getting it in the state of Indiana. So there's going to be an accentuation of these differences within federalism that in some ways are almost like, it's not going to happen like this, but there was some discussion last year about like civil war, and like Texas, there's some talk of secession, and there really are fundamental differences. You look on the map, there are some blue segments, and then upper Midwest, and then the coast. Almost everything else is red. And as someone who lives in the red, I don't feel so good.
Well, I mean, maybe just a few words before perhaps getting questions and closing. I mean, yeah, I do understand that the US case also is different in many ways than, let's say, Turkey or Hungary and India as well. Because, I mean, if you look at Modi or if you look at Erdogan, they're quite serious people. They're quite serious statesmen. You might not agree with their politics, but they know what they're doing. And you know more or less what to expect. Of course, they can do U-turns here and there, but still. So that's important. And I do agree. And, I mean, I don't know many of the names that you're mentioning who are now going to be in administration, but I can only imagine. But I know, for instance, who Elon Musk is, and I've just read in the news that he's going to be in the administration. And for me, it's nothing short of a dystopia, right?
Absolutely.
And of course, when US goes down that road, however progressive it might be, the ramifications in the entire world and the whole democracy agenda is 10 times higher than, let's say, what happens in Turkey or elsewhere. So that also is very, very concerning.
I apologize to you for that. I really am sorry.
Oh, you don't need to be. I mean, Jeffrey, it is what it is, right? What can we do about it? But having said that, now, and coming back to and circling back to Mark's question about the opposition. Now, in the Turkish case, the opposition has been very resilient. And this is despite the fact that we are a very centralized country and we don't have federalism of any kind and sort, like, let's say, the US says, like India has, etc. But still, that resilience has been rooted not just societally across the population, but also in local governments, which the opposition holds, right? Even though we're not a federal system and the local governments and administrations do not have the resources and powers that they do in federal systems, right? Still, they have been important locus of resistance. So because they adapt to the changing circumstances, they adapt their strategies in fighting with the center. And I can only imagine that in federal systems that kind of that adaptation might have even more space for maneuver over time when they learn the strategies of the government. They can find ways of tapping into new resources and also appealing. And there's also an advantage there in the sense that the local government has immediate access to the people. So that is how Erdogan rose to power, despite the Kemalist establishment, because he was delivering to the poor, to the impoverished in the outskirts of Istanbul. That's how he became popular. So you have a chance to appeal to those segments of society that do feel very disillusioned and resentment because of socioeconomic factors, because there is a face now that goes and that sort of connects with those voters. So I think that is important as part of the story of resilience of Turkish opposition, despite all this pressure. But other than, and also a final point is that, for instance, in the Turkish case, the government cares about winning elections, however unfair the tilting ground, the competitive ground might be, because they derive their legitimacy from the elections and they fear what happens when that legitimacy is lost. The elections are not free, they're not fair, they're not contested on equal grounds. The government has so much resources, access to media, all of this and that. But, the fact that they care about the result in the end, and they've put so much effort into the campaign and trying to deliver just enough to get the votes, means that there is a scope for opposition parties to campaign and to compete for votes. And so that also keeps the resilience going to some extent under difficult circumstances.
Thanks. So I'm mindful that we're almost to the bottom of the hour. So let me attempt to kind of combine a couple of questions we've gotten, and then we'll offer you a chance to respond to those questions, and we'll wrap up after that. And the first one comes from my colleague at the India-China Institute, Manjari Mahajan, who is returning to Pratap's point about the systemic crisis. Can we see what is happening across these countries, at least partly, a fallout of a particular model of globalization and capitalism, which, as I alluded to earlier, has bred inequality, low job growth, concentrations of wealth, and the middle is falling out, as it were, in many countries. And combining, just tagging onto that, our colleague Nidhi Srinivas, who's in the audience, has asked us to reflect on the F word, fascism, which, of course, was a response to an earlier epoch of some of these same global systemic crises a century ago, but maybe not. Anyway, just thoughts on the big picture of a global or a systemic crisis that helps us understand the current moment.
I'll go first.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No,
please go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to ignore the fascist question. I do think Donald Trump is a fascist. Whether fascism is coming to America is a more complicated question. It's a real question. But in any case, yes, there's obviously, there is a global crisis. And it relates to what you described in terms of, let's say, neoliberal globalization, model of development, whatever, which by the way, I actually think there was no alternative. There was no alternative, like in a political sense. It would have been good if there was an alternative, but it turned out that there wasn't. I think it goes beyond capitalism. And I think climate change is part of this. Massive displacement of people, migration, moving north, demographic change, which has self-complicated sources. But I think also the fact that the institutions that have long imagined that they might manage all of this, the institutions of the liberal democratic state or any state, are increasingly weak in the face of the magnitude of the problems, which are in some ways, I really do take climate change and global warming as, like, in some sense, a metaphor. Okay. So, I once wrote a lot about Hannah Arendt, and I wrote about her idea that democracy, at the end of On Revolution, she says it's like an oasis in a desert. Well, she doesn't quite say that, but I'm just saying that's my interpretation. Oasis in a desert or an island in an ocean. And the truth of the matter is, sea level's rising, and more of the islands are being overtaken by the water, and there's desertification taking place, and more fires and uninhabitable lands, forcing millions and millions of people from South America to move north just because they want to live. It's overwhelming in some sense. The institutions are the institutions that were created, like were envisioned after the French Revolution, more or less. Okay. Yeah. Parliaments, executives in nation states, and then later on political parties that would somehow organize people in meaningful ways to make choices that are more or less clear. All of that seems to me up for grabs now. It's a very serious crisis, indeed. Yeah.
Prashant.
Okay, we'll let Sanam have the last word and the last laugh. So,
Indeed.
I think 2 quick points. One, so I think a lot is said about neoliberalism and the crisis of neoliberalism and generates, and of course there is something to it, obviously, right? I mean, there were deep shortcomings in that model. It has, in a sense, created, I think, structural challenges all across the world, right? But I actually think that at this moment, the invocation of neoliberalism has become a kind of structural excuse. It's like too big. It's neoliberalism, whatever this thing is. Like Jeffrey, I actually think neoliberalism had something functionally going for it. I think for countries like India and China, whatever else you might say about that phase, it was comparatively as good a phase as any they've had in their history. So I think there is a case for 1.5 years for neoliberalism. The reason I think neoliberalism has become, I think, a little bit of an analytical obfuscation. So what is Trump's first announcement when he comes to power, right, after winning the election? He says, I'm going to introduce conflict of interest rules, that people who get appointed to the FDA cannot serve on pharma corporate boards immediately after resigning, right? Now, in any other country, we would have used the word corruption outright. And I think the biggest myth about US exceptionalism is this avoidance of the word corruption. It's vested interests, it's regulatory capture. Actually, half the problems are old-fashioned problems of corruption, right? I mean, I wish there were a little bit more market forces in neoliberalism in some areas. It is actually particular oligarchic interests being able to corrupt and capture the system through and through. And I think there is a problem in India as well. I mean, not that Trump and Modi will provide a solution, right? But I think sometimes neoliberalism, I think, lets specific actors, I think, get away with way too much. Oh, it's all neoliberalism. It's not all neoliberalism. If pharma companies are charging particular prices, nothing to do with market competition. The second thing, I think, which is the big elephant in the room, both for climate change, but I think also for democratic politics, is the future of the nation state form. If the world continues to think, I mean, obviously we need nation states. You can't do away with them. Democracy requires a sense of mutual identification, all of that, true. But it's very hard to imagine any of the problem of global public goods being solved if the current nation state ideology remains the dominant framework within which we approach these problems. And it's the nation state form that is impeding global cooperation, but it is also having deep domestic ramifications because this nation state form is increasingly be sustained only by ethno-nationalism of various kinds in some sense. The crisis of immigration is a reflection of that crisis. War and empire is a reflection of that crisis. So I do think we need to talk about corruption in the nation state form as much as we talk about neoliberalism.
Thank you. Senem,
Thank you.
your thoughts?
Yes, I do agree with the previous speakers, especially on the neoliberalism issue. But then I'd also like to bring in something else. I think there's a important caveat here that we have to be careful about, that national specificities are very important about how they have responded to neoliberalism. I mean, I teach and study European politics as well. I've been doing that for many years. Now, if you look at the case of Europe, for instance, which in some ways similar to the US, you see that excesses of neoliberalism has not been dealt with in an effective manner. And what's happened is that left has kind of abandoned labor and the working classes. And so, for instance, in Brexit, when you look at the people who are voting in favor, they're mostly in constituencies that used to vote for the left in Britain for so many years, you know, like up in the north, etc. So that tells you something about where those classes have been moving, right? So I think that's an important part of the story, perhaps more so in Europe and the US than, let's say, in Turkey, right? In Turkey, what happened is that the system actually allowed the government to deliver economically, right? It's not that people were suffering under the Justice and Development Party. No, they were doing better. The middle classes were expanding. Turkish economy had been growing. It still grows despite all the sort of issues with it. And of course, inequality has increased in the last couple of years, but until that point, they have delivered. So it wasn't that they weren't delivering economically or that the labor was suffering. They are now, but that came at a much, much later stage, right? So I think that's also something very important to keep in mind. And also, finally, of course, we should never underestimate the role of identity here. So it's not just about the economy and neoliberalism is, again, as I said, it's very, very important, especially in the Western context, the excesses of it and how they've not been dealt with the left, by the left in general. So that's a very important part of the story, but identity issues are also a very, very important part of the story. I mean, if you look at, again, from Europe across Turkey to Hungary to the US, I see all these very similar debates, let's see, on the progressive agenda, right? What, for instance, Orban also calls the liberal left dogma. How Erdogan keeps on talking about the LGBTQ issue as if it is an issue in Turkey, which is a Muslim country where it's never been sort of high on the agenda, but he's learning how it functions to consolidate the vote by, you know, scoping, you know, sort of by boosting the anxieties and fears on the part of people. So these are also important issues that shape the electorate that I think we should also be mindful of. But of course, how you respond to that, how you sort of develop a response to that in a way in which you can still win elections is a huge challenge, I think. And that goes much deeper into society. So.
Could I say one more thing? I
Yeah.
feel guilty. I feel obligated.
Please.
I don't want to have the last word, but just following up on that, we should have talked more about gender. And I also want to say, as the guy who's like here to talk about the US, I mentioned this a couple of times, but like the deep history of racism, especially anti-Black racism, is essential to understanding American political identity. And I wish we had more time to talk more about it, but I need to just mention it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Pratap. Thank you, Senem. This has been a really rich, rewarding, comparative discussion. We've brought up lots of very useful concepts to help us make sense of this global moment, of this domestic moment in each of the three countries we covered today. I thank the audience for joining us and reminding you that the full recording of this session will be available soon from the India-China Institute website. My thanks to the India-China Institute team and to the IT team at the New School, and wishing you a very pleasant rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Great.
Bye.
Thank you.